Hi, the poem we're going to look at today is London by William Blake, and it's poetry written at this era that was one of the reasons that got me interested in poetry in the first place, one of the reasons I went to university, and one of the reasons I'm absolutely fascinated by this era, the Romantic era, from the late 18th to the mid 19th century, really. And Blake's the earliest of the poems that we study in our anthology, and perhaps the first of the what we now term romantic poets, although they didn't call themselves that at the time. Blake's poem London has an abiding power. It was written over 220 years ago in 1794, and sadly still speaks to us today, especially those of us like my students and me who live in the outskirts of London. And some of the images that Blake paints in his poem I've given you here. These are pictures, or this is a picture from central London at the time that Blake was writing. And here we've got his famous image of mine-forged manacles, and down here we've got a picture of a hearse. And you might think that London had developed since 1794 and that some of the things that Blake complains about are no longer valid. And sadly, that's probably not the case. So let's get on with our poem. If you already know this poem, then pause the video at this point and answer the 3 questions. Then restart the video and check that your answers are right. This is a great way to revise the topics that we've covered, whether it be the poetry or Jekyll and Hyde or in spectacles, these content-rich topics. If you do little tests for yourself, you'll find that it's a really powerful way of revising and locking the knowledge into your long-term memory to ensure that it's there when you need it in the GCSE exam. Okay, like I've given you before, here are my tips. Pause the video and take notes. Use the layout I'll provide you with on the next slide to structure your notes. And if you find them useful, use some of the images to actually secure that information for you in your memory. And remember to test yourself regularly. Here's the structure that I suggest you use. Again, you can pause the video at this point and jot down that structure. This is not everything about the poem. This is by no means a complete analysis of the poem. This is enough for you to write about the poem in your GCSE exam. Okay, the context. As I've said already, this was published in 1794. At the time that this was published, ordinary people had very little power. In fact, most of them didn't even have a vote, which we would take for granted nowadays. So they couldn't really change the government. Blake was opposed to the abuse of power. Taxes were high, a lot of people were living in poverty, there was a lot of disease, a lack of education, especially if people weren't rich, and especially, unfortunately, for women. Blake was romantic, and he criticised both government and church and royalty, and wrote to try and achieve more equality for people, and to try and justify the fact that people needed their personal freedom. Blake wrote a lot, but he's particularly famous for a book called Songs of Innocence and of Experience. And in this book there are lots of parallel poems that show how innocent lives are ruined and innocence is stolen from people by an unjust and unfair society, where people are some people are abusing their power and the majority are living in absolute poverty. Okay, let's now have a look at the poem now. There's a copy on the blog for you to cut and paste and annotate if you want to. The first thing you'll notice is that I've picked out a whole load of quotations. These quotations are evident in every single stanza. Weakness, woe, cry of every man, infant's cry of fear, mine-forged manacles, chimney sweeper's cry, hapless soldier's sigh. We assume that's a death sigh. Blood, youthful harlot's curse, blast, newborn infant's tears, blights, plagues, marriage hearse. And we can see that throughout this poem there are constant images of misery and death. These suggest that escape from the situations that Blake's describing here, poverty, misery, injury, prostitution, illness, slavery almost, where chimney sweepers are concerned, is impossible. These people can't get out of it. It's absolutely tragic. In particular, this very famous quote, "Mine forged manacles," shows that people are so restricted they can't even think of a way out. They're almost responsible in Blake's view here for their own slavery or their own imprisonment. They are so downtrodden that they cannot even consider what life might be like in different circumstances. And I've given you that picture. Incredibly powerful image from Blake. The idea that people are so downtrodden that they're trapped. They can't even consider a way out. We might think about that in reference to today's London as well. Okay, the second language point I'd make is this repetition of "in every," especially in stanza 2, look, where it's the use of anaphora here, this repetition at the start of a line. And Blake's suggesting that no one is free from this, that all of the people in this class, all the people he sees in his London, the working class London, they all suffer. It's not just some, nobody escapes. The poverty and illness and injury that attends these people is universal. They're all suffering. And I find that a really powerful image. And I've given you again this image of this, slum-like street in London, crowded with people in overcrowded dwellings, with not enough sanitation, with insufficient sewage and fresh water, probably insufficient food. And Blake's saying in his poem that no one escapes this. And then my third language point is really a sort of a three-stage language point. Firstly, I pick out the words about restriction. Chartered means governed or ruled over. And then we've got ban and manacles here, both images that are to do with personal restriction. And then we see that Blake feels the people most affected are the young. Yes, there is a soldier here, and it does mention every man here, but we get infants mentioned twice, and even the prostitute who's mentioned in stanza 4, the youthful harlot, is young. Chimney sweepers, we know, were young. Some as young as 3, 4, 5 being pushed up chimneys. So we see the restriction and the images that are causing the misery, and we see that Blake sees the people that are most affected are the young children. And then we see highlighted in purple here who Blake feels is responsible. Those in power, the church and the palace. Of course, the palace here representing both government and royalty. Of course, we think of government sitting in the Houses of Parliament, but that's of course called the Palace of Westminster. And we see this idea that Blake's pointing the finger. He's saying, look, this is what the restrictions are causing, this misery. This is who it's affecting, and these are the people who we should be looking at to blame. So there's my third language point. Structure in this poem is very, very powerful, I think. A point you should definitely make. And it is here that Blake's genius comes out, really. So the poem is very strict. The structure in the poem is very tight, very strict. For instance, all the stanzas are quatrains, 4-line stanzas. The length of the lines is always the same. We've got 4 beats, iambic tetrameter, or 8 syllables in every line. And we've got very, very tight rhyme. Street, meet, flow, woe, man, ban. You can see that throughout the poem there is really strict rules, and this mirrors the strict rules imposed on the people. The strict structure in the poem mirrors the strict rules on, that are imposed on the people, which is causing this suffering. However, you need to listen to the rhythm of this poem. I wandered through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe, in every cry of every man, and so on. And you can hear that that rhythm is very, very much like a nursery rhyme. And Blake's writing about the impact on children here. And it's horrible, really, the way that this nursery rhyme rhythm contrasts or is juxtaposed to the horrific imagery of people dying and suffering. And I think that Blake's use of this rhythm emphasises the horror of what he's looking at as he walks through London. So I think that the structure in this poem really, really worth writing about. The second structural point I'll make is look at what the stanzas are about. Stanza 1, 2 and 4, about the people who are suffering. This poem concentrates on images of suffering among the population of London. But stanza 3 deviates from that because Blake wants to point the finger. There is suffering in here. The chimney sweepers cry and the unlucky soldiers sigh. But in this stanza we get to see who Blake blames. Again, church and government. And look at the distribution and the structure of the stanzas. There's much more about the people who are suffering, but Blake doesn't shy away. He's not scared of pointing the finger at who he thinks is responsible in stanza 3. So there's my second structural point. So Blake in this poem is clearly showing his anger. He's angry about the situation that ordinary people are living in, and he shows that through his brutal imagery, through this emotive language. You know, crying children, everybody suffering, illness, disease. Blake shows the situation as being horrific and damaging for everybody. The repetition there that we talked about of again, shows that he believes no one escapes. And he shows that people are so oppressed that they can't even think of a way out. An incredibly powerful piece of poetry here. We see that Blake feels, creates in the reader sympathy for the people who are suffering, and particularly maybe anger at the people who are responsible. We are especially sorry because the people suffering here are chimney sweeps and child prostitutes and their children. And it's very emotive for the reader to see the suffering of young people here. Now, I think that the tragedy in this poem lies, as I said at the beginning, that over 220 years later, you can walk through London and still see homelessness. So even though he's the first of our poets the earliest of our poets in the 18 that we study, it seems that London has a message for us today. It's something that we perhaps still need to be picked up on. As like I say, you walk through London and there is still suffering, there is still homelessness, there is still poverty. And perhaps, even though he's the earliest, Blake saw more clearly into the future than many of the poets who came after him. I hope this has been useful, and I hope you find this poem as fascinating and powerful as I do. See you next time.